Hey folks, and welcome to the Learn UI Design lesson on starting a new UI design project. So in this video, what I want to do is give you a 4-step process for beginning any UI design project. And sure, different projects are going to have different processes, absolutely, but I want to give you kind of a general outline that you can follow, whether you're doing, say, just a single page homework assignment for this course, or you're doing a multi-year project with your employer. Doesn't matter, you take the same 4-step process. Dial it up if you need, dial it back if you need, but you kind of have an outline of how to proceed as soon as you know you're going to start working on something new. So let's dive right in. First, I'm going to review this 4-step process, talk a little bit about each of the steps in turn, but then we're going to look at a couple examples where we apply it and see kind of how things play out. The first step anytime you start a new UI project is to determine your brand and your goals. And by brand, all I mean is what you want your users to feel about you. Should your users feel that you're really authoritative and official, or should they feel that you're like friendly and casual, or that you're kind of buttoned up, and just whatever adjectives they would use or short phrases they would use to describe you, that's your brand. It's as simple as that. Likewise, goals is anything that you just want your users to do. Maybe you want 10% of people visiting this page to sign up for your mailing list, or maybe you want your page to be accessible to users with screen readers. We'll talk about a couple different types of goals that you can have in just a moment, but overall the important thing is right when you get going on a new project, figure out what you want your brand to be. This is especially critical for you doing the UI design work, and then also figure out what goals you want to hit. What determines if a project is successful? Next, you're going to collect and compile inspiration. And this step has a lot of wiggle room depending on just how big your project is. If you're a pretty experienced designer and you're working alone, maybe you're just doing a side project or something, you may not actually really compile any inspiration specifically at the start. But especially if you're more of a beginning designer or you're working with a larger team, you just want to be really clear about what's inspiring you and why, and what's influencing you and why. And this is something that you'll be very conscientious about. Now, there's actually a whole separate video just on this step, so I'm kind of going to gloss over it in this video. The third step is to sketch and wireframe, and like the second step, how much you sketch and how much you wireframe really depends on the complexity of your project. If you're working on something, say like a blog, you may not do much wireframing at all, just kind of quickly sketch out, yep, title's going to be at the top, post is going to be below that, the author's name might go here, but you can pretty quickly get to the details of the visual design. With a more complex and interactive project, the process of wireframing overall might also include researching your users, iterating on low-fidelity designs, maybe usability testing some of your designs, etc., all before doing the visual design work to make those designs look great. For the purposes of this course, I'm just going to assume that you have a sketched out version of the interface ready to go. If you are interested in how you get to that step and how you make usable designs, I have a whole other course on that called Learn UX Design, and that covers the wireframing, the usability testing, the user research, etc. But for now, we're going to presume we have a sketch that's ready to go, and we're just going to be focusing on the visual design. And then the fourth step is to explore visual styles. And so there's kind of this connection between the first step and the fourth step, because what you determine as your goals and your brand actually affects what visual styles you're going to start to play around with. When you get specific about what your brand is, that affects everything in your visual style, your colors, your typography, the illustrations or the photography or the icons that you use, even the tone of voice that the text on your site is in. So this step is really just about starting to explore little snippets of UI, pieces of text or buttons or UI controls or common repeating elements. And as an official deliverable, this is often called style tiles. So at the highest level, that's how you start a new project. First, you determine the brand and goals, you collect some inspiration, you sketch out the general overview of the screens, and then you start filling in details, exploring different fonts, colors, UI components, etc. Now let's take these ideas and start looking at a sample project. So here's a short brief for a project called Genius Notes, which is actually something that I worked on just a bit ago. My client Danny came to me and talked about wanting to create high quality written guides that basically take a whole variety of skills and teach you the very best way to learn those skills. The way he described it, which really kind of hit it home for me, is he said, have you ever learned some skill and when you were a beginner you had no idea what book you should be reading, what teacher you should be listening to, etc. And then once you kind of get into that world, you realize that almost everyone who's really good kind of respects the same couple resources. And he's like, we just want to recommend those resources for every single skill. The monetization would be through affiliate links of recommendations for different products and services. And Danny stressed that the affiliate deals are not going to really influence which recommendation is picked. So it's all neutral. The whole concept is this site will build your trust by recommending the very best resources. And if they happen to make some money from that, that's awesome. All right, so step number 1 is really picking what goals does our design need to achieve and what does success look like here. So one of the first things to focus on with goals is how the site makes money. And how the site makes money is going to be tied into what the design is. So for instance, if this site is making money through affiliate links and affiliate recommendations, then the recommendations need to be front and center. But that's kind of a short-term fix because on the other hand, the recommendations also need to be trusted. If the site doesn't earn your trust over time, it doesn't matter how front and center the recommendations are, no one's going to buy them anyways. Now, goals related to how a site makes money are one thing. You'll also see kind of behavioral goals. Do we want people to download something or subscribe to something, purchase something, donate, maybe use a new feature, whatever. I have a whole bunch of behavioral goals listed on the starting a project cheat sheet attached below. For the purposes of this project, just saying that we really want the recommendations to be front and center and have people buying them, that's kind of all we can do for right now. There's also user experience goals. For instance, we might have different devices that we want this to work on. So in this case, this is going to be a responsive website, meaning it needs to work across mobiles, tablets, desktops, whatever. Sometimes I'll also throw in something about users must find the app simple and usable or easy to use or whatever. But for a site that's comprised mostly of articles, that doesn't really strike me as quite as important. And then one other type of goal that's important to list is context goals. So in this case, like what's the context of the user? The user in this case is mostly going to be finding articles via Google. So everything essential about the site does need to be conveyed via the guide pages rather than say like the home page or the about page. So I'll just put guide page must convey all necessary information to new users. Perfect. And even though this is just kind of a rough stab at things, this is actually decently similar to the list that we came up with. And listing goals just like this, even if it's like a little bit of a rough draft, is a couple things here. First of all, listing your goals makes you more likely to achieve them, right? If you don't know your goals, you're really only going to be hitting them on accident. But beyond that, if you're working with a client or an employer, when you show that you are laser focused on taking their business goals and translating them into a website and then meeting those goals, you're making your client trust your judgment here. And I'll also talk about this a lot more in the getting good design feedback and presenting your designs lesson, but you're making your future design reviews a lot easier because presenting your design based on how it meets the goals you laid out in the beginning is the single best way to structure a design review, and it will get you way better feedback if you do that. Now, I'll just say for like really small projects, like a Learn UI Design homework assignment, or maybe you do some sort of 100 days of UI exercise, you don't really need to worry too much about these goals. Instead, for that, what I would do is just jot down a couple notes on brand that you're trying to achieve and just leave it there. And so, yeah, let's use that as a transition to talking about brand here. When I say brand, that might sound like something that's kind of hand-wavy or a little artsy and mysterious. I really don't mean for it to be. Brand is simply what you want your users to perceive you as, and it's as simple as coming up with just a list of adjectives, right? And so when I was working with my client for this particular site, I started asking him questions, trying to really get a handle on what kind of brand he was going for. I said, hey, what are like similar sites that you kind of look up to or think are doing something right that you also want to do right? The very first thing he said was the Wirecutter. And the Wirecutter is a recommendation site. It's known for just being ridiculously thorough. This is an article on the best robot vacuums. It is 17,000 words long. And they test, perhaps dozens of vacuums. They spend scores of hours doing this, and they write a small novel of a report on which one they thought was the best, okay, it's the Roomba. Great, now you know. So we talked about the Wirecutter and why that was so awesome. And we started coming up with little phrases like, it earns your trust, or it's slightly obsessive. It's also balanced. They're not playing favorites. They actually want to get to the bottom of what's the best. Another thing that Danny was inspired by was the Amazon Kindle logo, right? Here's just this boy sitting on a small hill in the starry night, a very small hill in the starry night, just reading his Kindle. And it's kind of reflected in some of these screenshot images. You got like the beautiful bookstore vibe going on the screen itself, but then it's surrounded by this just serene nighttime landscape. And there's just a little bit of sense of wonder in that. Now, sometimes sites are going to be not even close to being competitors to the thing that you want to do, but they inspire you along some other axis that you just can't ignore. So Wait But Why, this was awesome for Danny because it embraced its own geekiness, in his words. Here's a giant article on the Fermi paradox, which is about why we haven't found aliens in the universe. If you've never been to Wait But Why, it's a bit of a silly blog. There's a lot of like hand-drawn stick figure images and stuff. The writing is really, really casual, but just goes into incredible depth, right? I mean, you can see this is also an extremely long article. So that was something that we also wanted to do. Another way to kind of determine your brand is to start asking yourself, what are you not? Like, what would, if your users thought X about you, what would be a failure? And so that started to generate some more ideas. Preaching or boasting, right? Genius Notes shouldn't be big. It shouldn't be spammy. Shouldn't be inhumane or sloppy, etc. Now, one thing that's interesting about these is they can actually start to generate, if you take the opposite of them, they can start to kind of generate more adjectives of what you're going for. So we're humble, not boasting. Or we are considered, not spammy. Or we're precise, not sloppy. And it's as simple as this. I've got a couple other brand questions in the Starting a Project cheat sheet, just things to kind of get you thinking and generating this little list of adjectives. Now, from this list, Danny said, here's the ones that are kind of the most important. Trustworthy, right? So that came from earning your trust. We talked about that a bunch. Geeky, talked about that, embracing your own geekiness. Humble and balanced. And it really only took us not even 2 hours to get to this point. But already this is really exciting to me. And my designer sense is like already coming up with ideas of how I'm going to try and convey this trustworthiness or this geekiness or the humility, using little pieces of interface or fonts or colors or whatever it is. Now, my goal in this video is to also kind of kickstart your designer sense into starting to translate adjectives like this into interfaces. Whenever you're determining your brand, I really want to hit home that there's two things that you should always be doing. The first, picking those adjectives or short phrases, right? Trustworthy or touch of wonderment. Because the big secret here is that a lot of the seeming subjectiveness of UI design fades away when you specify what you want your users to feel and then you design to those ideas. Like, for instance, we wanted Genius Notes to be trustworthy, but what's a trustworthy font? Well, I think you already have some idea of this. So I want to show you something that you've probably never seen before. This is the New England Journal of Medicine, where every single font on the site is replaced with Comic Sans. And as you scroll through this, it's like really difficult even to take it seriously. I even find it tough to view it as a completed design. Like, it looks a little bit kind of just like a wireframe. And in large part, that's because Comic Sans is not a font that inspires trust. But if I go and I remove that single line of code that replaced all fonts with that, all of a sudden things look a lot different. It just looks a lot more considered and professional and trustworthy. And the feel of it totally changes just with the typography alone. Now, that's kind of an extreme example, but that's the sort of thing that we're going to be applying to everything. All right, and the second part of determining your brand really has to do with picking the opposite qualities that you want to convey. But what can be really good is not to pick some straw man, we don't want to be bad customer service. We want to be good customer service. That's not really a brand value. The very best brand values have defensible opposites. For instance, scrappy is a great brand value because the opposite of scrappy is like authoritative and official and trustworthy, and that's a perfectly reasonable thing that a site or a brand might aspire to. Now, to be clear, some of the things we've chosen have opposites, right? We want to be humble, not boasting. But if we were trying to make boasting a little more defensible, we might say we don't want to be humble, we want to be humble, we don't want to be omnipotent or something. Like you could imagine a site which is written where the tone of voice is just very wise and almost omnipotent. No, we want to avoid that. Or balanced. We want to be balanced rather than, the opposite of balanced isn't just biased, right? That's not a very positive thing. We might say we want to be balanced rather than loyal. Loyal sounds like a positive thing, but in this case, it's what we want to avoid. And if we start sounding loyal, we know we're kind of getting away from our brand values. I can actually kind of just put these up here, right? Trustworthy rather than, say, casual is maybe the more defensible version of untrustworthy. It just has a different value than inspiring trust. For geeky, I don't really know of a defensible opposite, but in this case, let's say geeky rather than bored. Even though bored isn't really defensible, I would still say that if we ever come across sounding bored when designing the site or writing the site, we know we're getting away from our brand values. Humble, we already talked about. And same thing with balanced. So we can say, okay, cool, we're done with step one. Now we're going to move towards collecting and compiling some inspiration, which actually, if you were paying attention, we were starting to do that. When I asked my client, hey, what are the sites that inspire you? Even if it's in a totally different field or doing a totally different thing, where do you kind of draw inspiration from? That's starting to get at the heart of step two. Now, again, there's a whole other video that explores this in a lot more detail. Then it would be time to sketch and wireframe out a little bit. But honestly, with something as straightforward as an article recommending a product, I'm probably not going to take the time to do too in-depth sketches. Instead, I'm going to start exploring visual styles. So step 1 and step 4 are really where we're going to be spending most of our time in this video. All right, so we've got this brand, trustworthy, geeky, humble, balanced. It's a recommendation site. We're trying to give these really high quality recommendations. Let's start with typography, right? Let's start trying to distill these brand values into typography, and that's actually really a fantastic place to start for a site that's mostly made of articles anyways. So, what fonts, when you think of trustworthy, when you think of trustworthy, what fonts do you think of? Or even what general category of fonts? You don't really have to know too much. I realize this video is in the beginning of the course, so don't fret if you're like, I've got no idea. But the thing I'm thinking of is serifs. Serif fonts just tend to look a little more detailed, considered, official, classy, old, wizened, whatever. When I think of trustworthy, I think of serif fonts. And so I'm going to do something like come to my good fonts table, which is a resource in the 4th unit, the typography unit. I'm going to filter by serifs, and I'm going to start going through this list. I'm going to find ones that I think might be worth kind of playing around with. And so I actually went and stole these fonts from the file that I was designing in because these are the actual ones I looked at. So here's Freight Text Pro, that's in my good fonts list. This is Freight Display, which is really similar. It's in that same family. Merriweather is another one on the list. Meta Serif's on the list. More Pro, PT Serif, Tisa Pro. So all these are on the list. I'm just looking at my own list of fonts, kind of the best of my own past judgment, just filtering down into a couple different starting points. And maybe you have some idea of what you think looks the most trustworthy here. Maybe you don't. Either way, it's really fine. The whole point of this exploring visual style step is just to get some stuff out there and start mixing and matching and seeing what feels right. Now recall that our other big value here was geeky, right? What fonts are geeky? Well, again, I'm going to go back to my good fonts table here. Maybe monospace fonts are geeky, right? Because they kind of remind you of, say, typing into a computer terminal or something like that, coding. So over here, I just copied a couple possible bylines. Each of these are in the monospace fonts: Fira Mono, Inconsolata, Input Mono. Of these, I think Input is kind of my favorite, right? And And when I start to look at these letter forms, and by the way, I mean, we're going to get way more into this in the typography unit, but I just want to make it so clear that when this seems like something that's really subjective and loosey-goosey, our whole process for figuring out what font to use is listing a bunch of adjectives that match what we want our users to feel, and then trying to match those adjectives to fonts. And when we're matching the adjectives to fonts, we're like looking at the shapes of letters here. I love that the letters here are so squared off, right? That just makes it feel particularly geeky. And you know, it's happening to some degree with these, but this one is by far the most pronounced. And so maybe I'll take that as a jumping off point, and I'll say, what other fonts kind of exhibit some of that squared off nature? All right, I can go here. Let's cancel the mono filter, but let's just search square. Yeah, squared. Okay, cool. And already I see, oh, I've got Clear Sans on this list. All right, well, Clear Sans, let's throw that one in here too. And another one we had was DIN 2014. That one's on Adobe Fonts. Perfect. Another thing I can do here is when I'm just kind of messing around with little styles and trying to find a font, I will put them in uppercase. Exploring uppercase is an important part of choosing your font. We talk about that in the typography unit. But now I've started compiling a bunch of ideas here, and I could start to mix and match a title font with a little byline font right here and figure out what's going to look the best. What do I like? What don't I like? Now, in a second, I'm going to have you pause the video. So actually get your finger ready to press the spacebar or pause button or whatever. I want you to open up the Good Fonts table in another tab. I want you to open up your design app of choice. And I want you to take a stab at kind of designing just a trustworthy yet geeky title mixed with a byline. You can throw in a first paragraph of body text too if you're feeling really ambitious. You can use one of the fonts that I've listed here. You can use a different one. I recommend using the Good Fonts table unless you have a strong sense of other fonts that you like and feel trustworthy or geeky. But go ahead, pause, do that little exercise, and we will see you in just a sec. All right, welcome back. Now I want to show you the fonts that I picked for this. But the way I'm going to show you is I'm actually just going to give you the presentation, a very brief version of the presentation that I gave to my client. This was kind of my first stab at putting together some UI that met all the brand values we had established. So the whole way this presentation was structured is I put our mission at the top, make accessible the best way to learn any given skill, and below that, each of the 4 main brand values. Then whatever I've put on this screen that this slide is talking about, I've highlighted the brand value that it most relates to. So in this case, the article title, How to Learn Yoga the Best Way for Most People. One thing we had talked about was that Genius Notes should really give kind of the middle of the road way that's going to be most effective for most people. Well, that's balanced. Awesome. And it's also making accessible the best way to learn a given skill. Now we change the font, right? So here's this font, Freight, from the Good Fonts table. That's the one I went with. And Freight in particular is really trustworthy. Its finely crafted letters reflect the careful recommendations in each Genius Notes guide. Then we've got a little byline going on here. We'll pair Freight with a Techie squared off terminal inspired font. This one is Plex. I didn't show you Plex just a minute ago, but this is also in the Good Fonts table. And yes, it's geeky. Another thing, and this doesn't pertain as much to the UI design that we're going to cover in this course, but the copy really can affect the brand too. If someone sees how recent this was, which it was recent when I gave the presentation, that's kind of a real cool sign that actually this site does care about its guides and tries to keep them up to date. That's trustworthy. So there's a number of things that I call out in this presentation that are about how I say something or what the page actually says, the copy, the text on the page. This happens to be calling out just how impressive the teacher's little resume is here. And by the way, when I talk about doing a style tile, this is the sort of thing I'm saying. I've taken a couple different font styles, the headline font style, a little byline piece here, a little author bio, an author photo, and I've combined them all together in the way that they would be displayed on the site. So if you're working with clients and looking for kind of an in-between deliverable after you've established your brand and your goals, but before you're actually designing out the whole UI, show them a couple style tiles like this. Just say, how do we feel about this direction? I'll keep going here. You can read the text if you want, but it's a little bit more about the actual text here. And then, of course, we put in some high-quality imagery with people doing yoga. And then we start to scroll down. This is as we get into the article. And my callouts here are about all sorts of aspects of the design. We've got the top learning resource. The what? Well, and then we're using this as a little chance to explain a bit more about how the site works. Again, the users are coming from Google. We can't rely on them having seen the about page or the home page, so we have to explain this sort of stuff in the article itself. And I'm just trying to give my client the sense that everything I've done here, it's all precise and it's all goal-based. We scroll down a bit more, the same sort of thing is going on, etc. And at that point, the presentation comes to an end. How does it end? It doesn't end with me presenting 10 other concepts or anything else like that. It's just above, here's what I designed, here's how it meets our goals, how are we succeeding at those standards, how are we failing, and how do we move forward? And this project ended up going extremely smoothly, in large part because I just kept the design so focused on what the goals were. Also, if you were one step ahead of me the entire way, you may have said, if your brand value is humility, why the heck is your name Genius Notes? We recognized that too, and by the end of the project, the site had changed to the name Guidery. Guidery had incredibly long form articles here, a home page, simple, clean, to the point, trustworthy. Even the about page felt very considered and carefully done. Okay, so at this point, you might be wondering, there's so many brand adjectives. What do I have to do? Learn how to translate every single brand adjective into different typography styles and colors and imagery styles and whatever? No, you do not. There is an 80-20 rule at play here, which is to say an 80-20 rule is when 80% of the work comes from 20% of the effort, or 80% of the output comes from 20% of the input. In our case, what I want to have you do is master the 20% of possible brand adjectives or brand values that you will see 80% of the time. So without further ado, let's talk about the 5 most common brands that you're going to see. And I'm just going to do a quick rundown on how they influence typography, color, imagery. But really, you don't have to worry too much about the details right now. I just want you to get familiar with these 5 brands and kind of start to recognize when you see them and notice the patterns of what's happening when good designers design to meet these brand values. The first one is clean and simple, and that is by far the most common client request that I've had. Hey, we just want something that's clean and simple, neat, and modern. Typography for clean and simple is often going to be sans serif fonts, in particular grotesque sans. If you know what that means, great. If you don't, do not worry about it. We'll get to it later. Likewise with calling this the primary palette. All you need to know is there's bright, clean, primary hues. You know, it's like the 4-pack of crayons you get when you go to a restaurant and your toddler wants to color on the menu. Or you'll see mono hue schemes where the whole site basically just has one main theme color and variations of that theme color are used throughout. We'll get to all this in the color unit. The imagery might be illustrations or photos. Now, the next most common brand, and I don't know if this is maybe second by rank, but it's certainly pretty easy to know when you see it, is fancy, luxury, kind of formal brands. They might use serif fonts, and they're much more likely to have a palette of grayscale. Maybe there's gold accents or something. And if there's any photography, it's going to be extremely high quality, very beautiful stuff. Then there's also friendly sites. This is just the sites that you load them up and you're like, wow, this site is very casual. It's very friendly. It's chipper, feels nice. They're almost always going to be using sans serif fonts of some sort or another. And again, we'll get to the color unit exactly what these mean. With a friendly site, sometimes you might see some like cute little illustrations or something like that. Probably not something you're going to see on a really fancy site. Or if it's done, it's going to be done in a very different style. Quirky, this one might be the least common brand that your clients will have you do, but a lot of designers get interested in doing this themselves as they see kind of all these other projects that fit in these other buckets. And Quirky, sometimes they're going to have maybe quirkier fonts or more of a muted palette, more likely to have an orangish red than a pinkish red, for instance. And if there's illustrations, they might kind of further enhance the quirkiness. So we'll get into some examples in a sec. And then the final one is, I'm just calling it techie. Anything that's technical or scientific or futuristic. We talked about squared off sans serifs being kind of geeky. That would fit very much in this vibe. Talked about monospace. You'd also see plenty of uppercase and so on. This also has different connotations for what you'd see in the color and the imagery. Now, if you're watching this on your toes, you might be thinking, wait a second, Eric, you just showed us this example where we had a serif font, and yeah, it was kind of going for this like not really fancy, not luxury, but like trustworthy vibe, and it kind of feels like it matches this row, and yet at the same time, we also had some techie aspects, right? We're going for that squared off sans serif font. It's kind of a vibrant orange. Can we really be two of these at the same time? Or does it just count as clean and simple? How do they all fit together? Okay, here's your answer. Here's how it all fits together. This might be one of the most egregious simplifications in the entire course, but bear with me. I have smashed the 4 most common brand adjectives into one chart. And these sites you might recognize as the reference sites from the Building Your Gut Instinct lesson, except now they're on a 2x2 grid. So the whole idea here is if you want to see a site that's really fancy, you look towards the top. For instance, simplest.com. Cool, I can just open this link. I guarantee you I did not make the table on purpose, but we are definitely looking at a grayscale, gold accent, serif font, high quality, very classy, formal looking site. On the other sides of the spectrum, if we wanted to see something that was maybe a little more quirky, kind of way down here, we could look at a site like Abstract. And sure enough, Abstract is a little bit quirky. It's got these kind of gratuitous button animations and this font, which, even though it's technically a serif font, it just does not feel very formal. It's a little more playful and wild. On the friendly side of the spectrum, we could rail it all the way on this end, and we could look at the site for Zeta Labs. And Zeta Labs has a much softer, kind of a rounded off font here. They've got playful animations of their employees shooting each other with lasers. They actually say the words "shut up and take my money" on a site that sells something, and so on. They also tell you that designers should be focused on your business goals, which, hey, Zeta, you are preaching to the choir. So that's really the friendly side of the spectrum. And then finally, what's all the way on the techie side, the science, authoritative, futuristic side? Origin Materials is a good example of that. You look and you see this sans serif logo, super squared off, black and white, stark photography. I scroll down, it feels like I'm scrolling through a blueprint. Still kind of sparse, but neat and clean, etc. You get the idea. Now, the whole premise of this chart is that it's actually kind of difficult to be both fancy and quirky at the same time. If you focus too much on being formal and luxurious, you're going to find it very tough to also be offbeat in a convincing way. That may not be strictly true. The best designers might be able to kind of hit these opposites, or they might be able to be very techie, maybe futuristic and authoritative and yet casual, but it just doesn't kind of seem right. So don't treat this chart as just representing the exact location where every one of these sites lives and they couldn't be anywhere else, and this is right and any difference of opinion is wrong. Instead, kind of treat this as a resource that's directionally correct. When you know what brand values your site is trying to hit, if any of those kind of lean in any of these directions, you can then check out, everything that's in that quadrant. So for instance, with Guidery, I said, hey, yeah, we have just a little bit of fanciness. It's not all the way up here with simplest, but it's maybe down here. We start at clean and simple, right? Just something that's very neutral and plain. And we go a little bit on the fancy side, and we brought it a little bit out to the techie side, just because we wanted something that was geeky as well as trustworthy. Well, that puts us in maybe the range of Quanta Magazine or Foundation Medicine. And if we open up Foundation Medicine's site, you can see there's some similar elements going on here. They've got these big, beautiful serif details. There's kind of some angularness. You've got a serif headline with a little small uppercase sans serif neat clean label right by it. Now our labels were below and they were orange instead of red, but you can start to see there's sort of similar elements throughout these sites. Likewise, if we look at Quanta Magazine, wow, it actually has the same exact thing. It's got a nice big serif headline and then a little uppercase sans serif label. And this is the site where when I looked at Quanta Magazine while working on Guidery, I thought, you know what? I think I can use orange as an accent color. And that's kind of the point. The idea is not, if I'm designing a site right here, to just totally ape off of one of these particular sites that happens to be nearby, but to use this whole quadrant as kind of inspiration. I'm mixing and matching elements from wherever I might see them. This chart or the inspiration that we compiled in step 2, wherever. All right, there's one other point I want to make about this chart, which, by the way, you can find the link to it in the resources below. But the point I want to make is this. Clean and simple, that most common thing that clients want, is right here in the middle. And to get clean and simple, we're actually going to focus a lot of the next unit on that. We want things to be very aligned. We want things to be very consistent. We want generous white space. That's really what's going to get us that clean and simple feeling. But you might get to the point somewhere down the road where once you've mastered clean and simple, you think that things are just a little bit boring. And this chart actually presents an answer for that. One of the biggest things you can do to spice up your designs, once you've already achieved clean and simple and can do that well, is to start trying to figure out what brand you need to inject a little bit more of. And so even if you didn't start a project by thinking of your brand values. It can help you course correct midway through. So here's an example of a fictional medical wholesale supply company, right? And I just want to point out that a lot of the design in this is technically pretty well done. It's very well aligned. It looks neat and clean. It's on a nice grid system. There's decent white space, at least considering how much content I need to display and how small the screen is. But honestly, it's a little bit boring, right? And so if I was working on this site, I might think, how do I add a little more zing here? How do I add some excitement? It just looks kind of bland. Now, if I wasn't familiar with different brands being kind of offshoots from Clean and Simple in different directions, I might not really have a good idea of where I should go. But if I know that the answer is to really get a good handle on what brand I'm trying to convey, then I can sit down with my client and I can say, hey, I want you to tell me what MedDepot is all about. I want you to tell me who you are and who you aren't, and I want you to tell me the principles that you stand for. I want you to tell me the principles you'd be willing to lose money for, right? I want to know, and by the way, a lot of this stuff is in the Starting a Project cheat sheet, these brand reflections. But you say, I want to know what you believe that all your competitors would disagree with, right? And say you start that conversation, and maybe it takes a while, maybe you have to meet a couple times, maybe there's some back and forth, but after a while they get it and they come back to you and they say, you know what, Eric, and I'm just making this up here. This is just a totally made up example, but maybe they come and they say, what we really stand for is just this idea of pro recognize pro, right? Like if you're a doctor, you're already one of the smartest people out there, and you're certainly one of the hardest working, and you're making life or death decisions every single day, while some people are like moving pixels around a screen, right? But if you're a doctor, you're like absolutely a consummate professional, and MedDepot is the company that wants to stand by them. And you say, whoa, that's totally different, right? If someone can describe their brand like that, even like they didn't just list adjectives, but you still get a sense of kind of what they're all about. And we can start boiling that down into different design changes that we want to make. So, first of all, this stock image, does this say, I want to stand by doctors? This guy doesn't even look real, right? Stock photography, we'll talk about this in the imagery lesson, but stock photography, using good photos is like a superpower in design. It's the same thing with using high quality fonts. Here's something that looks a lot more real, right? Like this guy, I don't know anything about doctors, but presumably he's like looking into someone's chest cavity right now, and he's wearing Packers gear as he does it. This is not fake. So let's start by just trying to get some imagery that really says, you know what? We see who you are. We recognize you as a pro, and we're going to honor that. All right, now we definitely need to change this. Text color, let's get this white. Let's remove about us, because that's not a very good call to action. It's not about MedDepot, right? It's about pros coming here, taking care of their needs, and getting on with their work. And actually, what if we took this headline, and instead of having 20,000 satisfied customers up there, which is maybe a little bit cheesy, what if we just said, helping 20,000 plus professionals do their best work? I realize they might not be selling directly to doctors. It's the problem with fictional examples. It's a little bit weird. One other thing we can do is just like throw on a black outline, not an outline, but a black layer here with 70% opacity, and it just makes it a little bit easier to read this headline. And maybe while we're at it, let's actually also change the font a little bit. We know if we have this brand that's all about like selling high quality equipment to well-trained professionals, if you had to take a guess of whether that leans fancy, friendly, quirky, or techie, I think I would definitely say it leans techie, right? So maybe if I'm going to change fonts here, I want to go towards something that's a little bit more like a squared off font. In this case, we could play around with one like Clear Sans. You might remember that one from just a little bit earlier. Let's give it a slightly bigger size. Talk about this in the text unit, but headlines don't need to have very much line spacing. I'm just going to do the same thing. Clear Sans for not the whole page, right? But just a lot of this kind of header and subheader text. Now, as far as the colors go, blue is pretty inoffensive, and so I feel like I could actually pick something. Maybe I just pick a color from this image. So I can take this blue and then go and replace it with, I think I was seeing something like 170 was the hue. Don't worry too much about this color detail stuff. We'll get a lot more into it. Yeah, there we go. something like that. So now it's kind of a slate green, so to speak. We might also be able to do something with the blue too. If we're going to have a squared off font here, like Clear Sans, you can just kind of see in this E, it's not like a perfect circle. This O, not even close, right? Very squared off on the tops and on the sides. We're going to do the same thing with all our little shapes here. You can see this bounding box has a nice 4-pixel border radius here. We're going to take all the stuff. I'm going to use a plugin called Simulayer, and I'm going to select all the layers that have the same border radius. There we go. 4-pixel border radius. I'm going to select them all, and I'm going to give it just a 1-pixel border radius, just the slightest bit here. And then all of these things have kind of this softer 2-pixel border. I'm going to take a bunch of those and give them a 1-pixel border. I don't think that's going to fix it universally. There's still a couple little things I'm going to need to change individually here. But now all of a sudden it's just got kind of a tighter feel to it. I'm going to put one more black kind of scrim layer behind this. And there we go. We've taken the colors to these cooler slate grays. Just feels a little more technical and kind of almost colder, but it's also literally the colors of medical professionals. We took the font, we made it a little more squared off, kind of adding a sense of professionality or preciseness as well. And that's mirrored in the border radius and the border width and all the little shapes all around the screen. And we even made a couple text changes just to kind of back this all up. And so, all right, fine. This is, it's a site. It's great. But when you compare to where we came from, there's so much more attitude. There's so much, it just looks like this is a real thing. It's a lot more compelling. And that's the power of knowing your goals, specifying your brand, and designing to that. I've said it before in this video, and I know I will say it again in this course, but if you don't specify what your goals are, you will only be managing to hit them on accident. So whenever you start a new project, go ahead, figure out, just jot down a couple adjectives for what your brand is, or if there's a specific goal that you want to hit, write those down too. But design to those things. Not only will it make your design better, and that should be reason enough alone to do it, but it will also make your clients and your employers and the people you work with love you more and trust you more because you're on the same page as them and you're trying to bring your design to not just be some pretty picture that they can hang on their fridge, but to be something that solves the problems that you all have. And of course, as we saw, it's never too late to do a goal-focused or a brand-focused redesign. And even if you have a decent existing design, you can start to think, what are the brands that we're trying to convey? How do we do this? It's all a win. So let me know if you have any questions. We'll see you in the student community, and check out the homework below. Cheers.